The radar warning receiver screamed its electronic death song at 4:30 in the afternoon on July 24th, 1966. Major James Kasler's F-105 Thunderchief was locked. A Soviet SA-2 missile site had found him over the skies of North Vietnam. In 12 seconds, maybe 15 if he was lucky, a telephone pole-sized missile would launch from its pad, accelerating to Mach 3.5, carrying a 440-pound warhead designed to shred his aircraft into burning fragments. But Kasler wasn't running. He was diving straight toward the source of the radar signal. This was exactly what he wanted. He was a Wild Weasel, one of the most audacious breed of pilots ever to strap into a cockpit. Their job wasn't to avoid surface-to-air missiles. Their job was to bait them, to deliberately fly into the most lethal airspace on Earth and make themselves irresistible targets. They would wait until the very last second before a missile launch, locate the radar site controlling it, and destroy it with their own missiles or bombs. The margin for error was measured in heartbeats. The North Vietnamese had received their SA-2 guideline missile systems directly from the Soviet Union, starting in 1965. These weren't primitive anti-aircraft guns that could be dodged with skill and luck. The SA-2 could reach 59,000 feet, travel at 3.5 times the speed of sound, and its warhead didn't need a direct hit. It would detonate when it got close enough, sending hundreds of steel fragments through anything within its kill radius. On July 24th, 1965, exactly 1 year before Kasler's encounter, an F-4 Phantom became the first American aircraft shot down by a surface-to-air missile in Southeast Asia. Within months, the Soviet-supplied SAM sites were downing American aircraft at an alarming rate. Something had to be done. The Air Force's solution defied conventional military wisdom. Instead of avoiding the SAM sites, they would create a special group of pilots whose sole purpose was to seek them out. These pilots would use themselves as bait, flying modified fighters equipped with electronic warfare equipment that could detect and locate the radar emissions from SAM sites. They would fly ahead of strike packages, deliberately attracting the attention of enemy radar operators, waiting for that terrifying moment when the radar switched from search mode to tracking mode to engagement mode. The pilots chosen for this mission had a very specific response when first briefed on what they'd be doing. Captain Jack Donovan, one of the first Wild Weasels, summed it up with 4 words that became legend. "You gotta be shitting me." The acronym YGBSM would become the unofficial motto of the Wild Weasels, appearing on patches, painted on aircraft, and whispered like a prayer before particularly dangerous missions. The early Wild Weasels flew F-100F Super Sabres, 2-seat variants hastily modified with primitive radar detection equipment. The pilot flew the aircraft while the electronic warfare officer in the back seat operated the detection gear, trying to identify and locate SAM radars among the electronic chaos of the battlefield. The equipment was so crude that EWOs often had to stick their heads out of the cockpit to visually spot missile launches. But the real workhorse of the Wild Weasel mission would be the F-105 Thunderchief, specifically the 2-seat F and G models. The Thunderchief, or THUD, as pilots called it, was a massive single-engine fighter bomber, the largest single-seat, single-engine combat aircraft ever built. It could carry more bombs than a World War II B-17 Flying Fortress and fly at twice the speed of sound. But speed and payload meant nothing when facing an SA-2 missile that could outrun and outclimb anything in the American inventory. If you're finding this story as incredible as the pilots who first heard about this mission, hit that like button and subscribe to the Old Breed channel. We bring you the military history stories that defy belief but defined generations. The Wild Weasel mission profile was insanity codified into tactical doctrine. A typical mission would see two F-105 Wild Weasels leading a strike package of dozens of aircraft toward a target in North Vietnam. As they approached the target area, the Wild Weasels would accelerate ahead, deliberately flying at altitudes and speeds that made them perfect targets for SAM operators. The North Vietnamese radar operators, trained by Soviet advisors, knew exactly what they were dealing with. They had studied American tactics, learned to recognize the electronic signatures of different aircraft types, and developed their own counter-tactics. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse played at supersonic speeds, except both the cat and the mouse were armed with missiles. Captain Leo Thorsness, flying out of Takli Royal Thai Air Force Base, would become one of the most celebrated Wild Weasels. On April 19, 1967, he and his electronic warfare officer, Captain Harold Johnson, were leading a mission against the heavily defended Thai Nguyen Steelworks, 30 miles north of Hanoi. The mission went wrong almost immediately. Thorsness's wingman was shot down by anti-aircraft fire, forcing the crew to eject over hostile territory. Thorsness, already low on fuel, made the decision that would earn him the Medal of Honor. Instead of leaving the area, he turned back to protect the downed aircrew from approaching MiG fighters. What followed was 50 minutes of the most intense aerial combat of the Vietnam War. Thorsness engaged and destroyed two MiG-17 fighters with his 20mm cannon. When more MiGs appeared, he was out of ammunition. So he did something that shouldn't have been possible in a 7-ton fighter bomber. He outmaneuvered them, forcing one MiG to overshoot and fly directly into the path of another American fighter. But Thorsness wasn't done. Still dangerously low on fuel, he spotted an SA-2 missile site, preparing to engage the rescue helicopters, attempting to reach the downed aircrew. Without missiles of his own left to engage the site, Thorsness dove his Thunder Chief straight at the SAM site, flying so low and fast that the site couldn't track him. The psychological impact was immediate. The SAM operators, thinking they were under attack, shut down their radar and abandoned their launch sequence. By the time Thorsness finally headed for a tanker aircraft to refuel, his fuel gauges were reading empty. He made it to the tanker with literally seconds of fuel remaining. After refueling, instead of returning to base as ordered, Thorsness heard that another F-105 was critically low on fuel. He located the aircraft and guided it to the tanker, saving another aircrew from having to bail out over enemy territory. The technology the Wild Weasels used evolved rapidly as the electronic war intensified. The initial radar warning receivers could only tell a pilot that a radar was painting them, not where it was coming from. Pilots learned to weave their aircraft back and forth, watching the strobe on their warning scope, trying to triangulate the radar's position through deadly trial and error. The AGM-45 Shrike missile became the Wild Weasel's primary weapon. The Shrike was a clever piece of engineering. It homed in on radar emissions, following them back to their source like a bloodhound following a scent. But it had limitations. Its range was only about 10 miles, less than the SA-2's engagement envelope. This meant Wild Weasel pilots had to get dangerously close to their targets, often flying straight into the heart of the SAM's kill zone. The North Vietnamese quickly learned the Shrike's weakness. When they detected Wild Weasels approaching, they would turn their radars on just long enough to launch missiles, then immediately shut them down. The Shrike, suddenly blind, would fly ballistically and miss. The SAM operators developed a technique called blinking, rapidly turning their radars on and off, making it nearly impossible for Wild Weasel crews to get a good lock. This deadly dance required nerves of steel on both sides. Wild Weasel pilots would deliberately fly predictable paths, making themselves attractive targets, waiting for a SAM operator to take the bait. When the radar locked on, the pilot had to make a split-second decision. Was this a genuine engagement or a feint? Wait too long, and a missile would be on its way. React too early, and you'd waste your Shrike on a radar that would shut down before the missile arrived. Captain Merlin Dethlefsen, flying with Captain Kevin Gilroy as his EWO, demonstrated the extraordinary courage required of Wild Weasels on March 10, 1967. During a mission against the Thai Nguyen Steelworks, Dethlefsen's flight of 4 F-105 aircraft came under intense attack from multiple SAM sites and 57mm anti-aircraft artillery. 2 of the 4 aircraft were immediately shot down. Dethlefsen, instead of retreating, pressed his attack. Flying through a barrage of anti-aircraft fire, so thick that other pilots said it looked like a black cloud, he methodically attacked SAM site after SAM site. When one of his Shrike missiles failed to launch due to battle damage, he continued his attack runs with bombs and cannon fire. His aircraft was hit repeatedly. The hydraulic system was damaged, electrical systems were failing, and the aircraft was barely controllable. Still, Dethlefsen continued attacking SAM sites until he had exhausted all his ordnance. Only then did he and Gilroy nurse their crippled Thunder Chief back to Thailand, making an emergency landing with almost no control over the aircraft. Dethlefsen would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. The psychological pressure on Wild Weasel crews was immense. They knew that every mission could be their last, that they were deliberately making themselves the most attractive targets in the sky. The loss rate was staggering. Of the 16 F-105F aircraft initially deployed for Wild Weasel duties, 11 were shot down within 6 months. The stress manifested in different ways. Some pilots became superstitious, wearing the same flight suit mission after mission, refusing to wash it for fear of washing away their luck. Others adopted a fatalistic humor, joking that their job was to fly around until someone shot at them, then try to kill whoever it was before they succeeded. Major Bob Sandvik, a Wild Weasel pilot, described the mental state required. You had to compartmentalize the fear. You couldn't think about your wife, your kids, your life back home. You had to become the mission. The moment you started thinking about surviving instead of hunting, you were already dead. The North Vietnamese SAM operators, many of them trained in the Soviet Union, developed a grudging respect for the Wild Weasels. They knew these American pilots were deliberately seeking them out, making themselves targets. It became personal. Specific Wild Weasel crews would develop reputations, and SAM sites would compete for the honor of shooting down a particularly notorious crew. The electronic warfare equipment improved dramatically as the war progressed. The APR-25 radar homing and warning system could identify different types of radar emissions, distinguishing between search radars, tracking radars, and the distinctive signal of an SA-2's fan song guidance radar. The APR-26 could provide a rough bearing to the radar source, but technology was only part of the equation. Wild Weasel crews developed an almost supernatural ability to read the electronic battlefield. They learned to recognize individual radar operators by their patterns, how quickly they switched from search to track, how long they maintained lock before launching, their preferred engagement altitudes. Captain Chuck Horner, who would later command air operations during Desert Storm, flew Wild Weasel missions in Vietnam. He described the intimate knowledge required. You got to know your enemy personally. This guy always locked on for exactly 12 seconds before launching. That guy would fake a lock, break, then re-engage from a different position. It was like a chess game at Mach 2, except the pieces exploded. The introduction of the AGM-78 standard anti-radiation missile gave Wild Weasels a longer reach. The standard arm had a range of 35 miles and a memory circuit. If the target radar shut down after launch, the missile would remember its location and continue to the target. But the North Vietnamese adapted quickly, using decoy transmitters and rapid displacement tactics, moving their mobile SAM sites immediately after engaging. Do you know about the time a Wild Weasel crew continued attacking SAM sites even after their aircraft caught fire? Share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed to The Old Breed for more incredible stories of military aviation courage. On November the 17th, 1967, Captain John Rivak and his EWO captain, Stan Goldstein, were approaching a target near Hanoi when they detected multiple SAM sites activating simultaneously. It was a trap. The North Vietnamese had coordinated multiple sites to engage simultaneously, making it impossible for a single Wild Weasel to engage them all. Rivak made a decision that exemplified the Wild Weasel spirit. Instead of retreating, he accelerated toward the nearest site, launching a Shrike at point-blank range while his aircraft was being tracked by 3 different SAM radars. The missile destroyed the first site just as an SA-2 launched from another position. Goldstein called out the missile launch, and Rivak executed a maneuver that shouldn't have been possible in a fully loaded Thunderchief. He pulled the aircraft into a 9G barrel roll, the airframe groaning under the stress, rivets popping from the strain. The SA-2, unable to match the turn, detonated harmlessly below them. But they weren't clear. 2 more missiles were already airborne. Rivak dove toward the ground, accelerating past 700 miles per hour, the aircraft shaking violently as it approached its structural limits. At the last possible second, he pulled up, the G-forces so intense that both crew members momentarily blacked out. The missiles, unable to follow the violent maneuver, impacted the ground behind them. When they returned to base, maintenance crews counted over 200 holes in their aircraft from anti-aircraft artillery. The Thunderchief never flew again, but Rivak and Goldstein walked away. The human cost of the Wild Weasel mission was staggering. By the end of Rolling Thunder in 1968, 42 F-105 Wild Weasels had been shot down. The crews who survived their 100-mission tours were the exception, not the rule. Many flew their required 100 missions over North Vietnam, then volunteered for another tour, unable to abandon their fellow pilots to face the SAMs without experienced Wild Weasel protection. The tactics developed by Wild Weasels in Vietnam would revolutionize air warfare. The concept of suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD, became a cornerstone of American air doctrine. Every major air operation since Vietnam has begun with Wild Weasel-type aircraft, clearing a path through enemy air defenses. Captain Mike Gilroy, a Wild Weasel EWO, reflected on the mission years later. "We were insane, no doubt about it. But it was a calculated insanity. Every SAM site we destroyed meant dozens of other aircraft could complete their missions and return home. We painted ourselves as targets, so others didn't have to be." The technology race between Wild Weasels and SAM operators continued throughout the war. The Soviets introduced new radar frequencies, new tactics, optical tracking systems that didn't emit any electronic signals. The Americans responded with more sophisticated detection equipment, better missiles, and increasingly aggressive tactics. By 1972, during Operation Linebacker, Wild Weasel tactics had evolved into a fine art. The F-105G model, purpose-built for the Wild Weasel mission, carried the most sophisticated electronic warfare suite available. Crews could identify, locate, and engage multiple threat systems simultaneously. Major Jim O'Neill and Captain Carl Jeffcoat demonstrated the evolution of Wild Weasel tactics during Linebacker 2, the Christmas bombings of 1972. Flying their F-105G ahead of the B-52 strikes on Hanoi, they detected 17 active SAM sites in their sector. In 30 minutes of continuous combat, they destroyed 6 sites and suppressed 5 others, expending every piece of ordnance on their aircraft. When they ran out of missiles, they made dummy attack runs on the remaining sites, forcing them to shut down their radars and cease engagement. The B-52s following behind them suffered no losses in their sector, despite flying through what had been the densest concentration of SAMs in the world. The legacy of the Wild Weasels extends far beyond Vietnam. The motto, "First in, last out," became more than just words. It was a sacred promise. Wild Weasels would arrive in the target area before the main strike package and remain until every other aircraft had safely departed, regardless of fuel state, battle damage, or remaining ordnance. This commitment came at a price. Captain Merle Dethlefsen, describing his Medal of Honor mission, said something that captured the Wild Weasel ethos perfectly. "I wasn't brave. I was just too busy to be scared." When you're tracking 3 SAM sites, dodging flak, managing a damaged aircraft, and trying to protect the strike package, you don't have time for fear. Fear is a luxury Wild Weasels couldn't afford. The North Vietnamese eventually developed such respect for Wild Weasels that they would sometimes refuse to engage when they detected them in the area, knowing that illuminating their radars meant inviting destruction. This psychological victory was perhaps the Wild Weasels' greatest achievement. They had made the hunters become the hunted. By the end of American involvement in Vietnam in 1973, Wild Weasels had destroyed hundreds of SAM sites and saved countless aircraft. The exact number will never be known, as many sites were simply abandoned when Wild Weasels appeared, their operators unwilling to face the Americans who actively hunted them. The men who flew these missions came from different backgrounds, different parts of America. But they shared a common trait: the ability to master their fear and fly deliberately into danger, day after day, mission after mission. They weren't suicidal. They were professionals who had calculated the odds and decided that someone had to do this job, and they were the ones best qualified to do it. Today, the Wild Weasel mission continues with F-16 CJs and FA-18 Growlers, using technology the Vietnam-era crews could only dream of. But the mission remains essentially the same: find the enemy air defenses and destroy them before they can destroy you. The margin for error is still measured in seconds. The stakes still life and death. The motto, YGBSM, is still painted on Wild Weasel aircraft, still worn on patches, still whispered by crews preparing for missions in hostile airspace. It's a reminder of the audacious men who, when told they would deliberately bait surface-to-air missiles in the deadliest air defense environment ever created, had only one logical response: you really did have to be shitting them. But they did it anyway. First in, last out, every single time. The Wild Weasels of Vietnam proved that with enough courage, skill, and determination, even the most insane military concept could become a war-winning strategy. They turned themselves into human lures, trading their safety for the protection of their fellow airmen, and in doing so, they wrote one of the most extraordinary chapters in military aviation history. Their legacy lives on in every pilot who straps into a Seed aircraft today, knowing they're inheriting a tradition written in radio waves, missile smoke, and incredible courage over the skies of North Vietnam. The hunt continues, the game remains deadly, and somewhere, a pilot is looking at their mission briefing and thinking exactly what Captain Jack Donovan thought all those years ago. You've got to be shitting me. But they'll fly the mission anyway, because that's what Wild Weasels do.